The Concordant Assembly's final transmission to the Corvi homeworld was 7 words long, and it did not say goodbye. Productivity quota unmet, subsidy terminated, compliance is not optional. Elder Sale Nithra read those 7 words on a cracked terminal in the last functioning shelter beneath the city of Ashmoro, and she read them 3 times before she understood that her entire species had just been sentenced to death by a committee that had never once set foot on her world. The Corvi had served the Assembly for 140 years. They had mined the Ashmoro deep for rare elements until the deposits ran dry. They had fought 2 border wars as auxiliary levies, losing 11,000 soldiers to conflicts that were never theirs. And when the mines finally gave out, when there was nothing left to extract, the Assembly's productivity algorithms had run their quiet, bloodless calculation and determined that a species with nothing left to offer was a species not worth the cost of its own life support subsidy. Sale remembered when Ashmoro had been beautiful, or as beautiful as a mining world could ever be allowed to become. She remembered standing with her husband on the Deep's northern ridge 60 years ago, watching the twin moons rise over slag heaps that the Assembly's engineers had promised, back then, would someday be reclaimed into farmland once the mineral quotas were met. The quotas had never stopped. The reclamation had never come. And somewhere in the 60 years between that ridge and this shelter, her husband had died of a lung disease the Assembly's own medical corps privately admitted was caused by processing dust from the very mines that funded their contract. And her sons had died in wars fought for territory neither of them could have found on a star chart. And Sale had kept serving anyway, kept believing, the way an entire species can be taught to believe, that loyalty eventually gets repaid. No malice, no cruelty even in the way the Assembly understood the word, just arithmetic. Sale was 106 years old, and she had buried a husband, 2 sons, and more friends than she could count without her hands shaking. And she had believed, right up until that exact moment, that she had already learned everything grief had to teach her. She was wrong. This was a new kind of grief, the kind that comes not from loss but from being told by the only civilization that had ever claimed to want you that you were never actually wanted at all. 6 days of breathable air remained in the shelter. The atmospheric processors had been running on Assembly subsidy power for 3 generations, and without it, the toxic sublayer that had crept up from Ashmoro's dying core for the last decade would finish what the mines had started. 6 days. Sale had done that math herself, twice, hopping to find an error in it. There was no error. She gathered what remained of the Corvi Council, 9 of them now, down from 30 at the century's start, in a room lit by battery lanterns because the grid had gone dark within an hour of the transmission, and she told them the truth because there was no version of the truth gentle enough to soften. "We have 6 days," she said. "The Assembly will not help us. No member species is permitted to interfere with a productivity ruling on pain of sanction. We have sent distress calls to every registered relay in Assembly space. Not one has answered." "Then we die in our own homes," said Councillor Avrin, the youngest of them, barely 40, his voice flat with the particular exhaustion of a man who had run out of the energy required for despair. "At least there is a small mercy in that." "There is no mercy in it, Avrin," said an older voice from the back of the room, Councillor Thass, who had lost both her legs in the Second Border War and had never once in 30 years let anyone hear her complain about it. "There is only quiet. Do not confuse the two. I have buried enough people to know the difference." "Then what would you have us do?" Avrin snapped, and the fear underneath his anger was plain enough that nobody in the room held it against him. "Beg the Assembly for a mercy they have already told us, in writing, we do not deserve." "No," Sale said before the argument could grow teeth. "I would not have us beg the people who condemned us. I would have us ask someone who never made us any promises to break in the first place." She paused, letting the room settle. "I sent one more transmission an hour ago, not to the Assembly, to a relay outside its jurisdiction entirely. She did not tell them what species that relay belonged to, because she did not want to give them hope built on a rumor, a single overheard story from a Corvi trader who claimed he'd once been rescued from a derelict transport by a young species with no formal standing in the assembly, and according to him, no interest whatsoever in asking what you could offer them in return before deciding whether you deserve to live. She did not believe the rumor herself, not really, but 6 days of air leaves very little room for pride, and so Sail Nithra, elder of a dying world, had sent one desperate signal out past the edge of everything she understood, and now there was nothing left to do but wait, and breathe the air while it lasted, and hope that somewhere out in that vast, unfeeling dark, someone was listening who did not care what the Assembly's ledgers had to say about the worth of a life. 3 days later, on a relay station orbiting a human world called New Providence, Ambassador Ruth Osai stood in front of the Earth Coalition's Foreign Affairs Committee and did something she had been warned, in no uncertain terms, not to do. She played the recording. It was staticky, badly compressed, translated by a machine that had clearly struggled with Corvi grammar, but the voice underneath the distortion was unmistakably that of an old woman who had accepted she was probably speaking to no one at all, and was saying what she needed to say regardless. We do not ask you to fight the assembly for us. We do not ask you to risk your ships or your standing or your peace. We only ask that if there is any corner of your worlds where 6,000 people could breathe for a little while longer, you tell us where it is. We have nothing left to trade for it. We only have the asking. The committee room was silent when the recording ended. Senator Aldrich Voss, who had spent the last 2 weeks arguing publicly that Earth's newly minted seat in the Assembly was too fragile to risk over a species with no strategic value and a documented history of Assembly noncompliance, did not speak for a long moment. "Ambassador," Voss said finally, and his voice carried the weariness of a man who had already lost this argument in his own conscience an hour ago, and was only now catching up to the fact in front of an audience. "You understand this coalition fought for 11 years to earn our seat at that table. 11 years of proving to species who still call us primitive that we could be trusted to follow the rules of a system we did not build. You are asking us to spend all of that on people we have never met, who offer us nothing, in defiance of a law we agreed to when we signed the charter." "I understand exactly what that seat cost us, Senator," Ruth said. "I was in the room for 6 of those 11 years. I remember every insult we swallowed to earn it. But I would like someone in this chamber to explain to me what the seat is actually for, if not this. If we only ever use our voice to protect our own comfort, then we have not earned a seat at any table that matters. We have only rented one." Voss shook his head slowly. "Even so, the Assembly's non-interference doctrine exists for a reason. If we extract that population in defiance of a productivity ruling, we are not filing a complaint. We are committing an act the Assembly's own charter defines as open provocation. We have been members for 11 months. We could lose everything we've built." "I understand exactly what I'm asking," Ruth said. "I'm asking whether this coalition believes membership in the Assembly is worth more than 6,000 lives, Senator. Because if the answer is yes, I would like that recorded in the minutes, so that history remembers precisely which value we chose and precisely who chose it." It was not a fair thing to say. She knew that even as she said it. Politics rarely rewards fairness, and she had learned a long time ago that sometimes the only way to move an immovable room was to make the cost of doing nothing louder than the cost of doing something. The vote was 7-6. It was the narrowest margin in the coalition's short history, and it authorized exactly one ship. Captain Elias Marsh had been flying relief logistics for the coalition for 6 years, mostly ferrying medical supplies to colonies too small to matter to anyone but the people living on them, and he had never once been handed an assignment that came with a formal warning attached. "If the Assembly intercepts you before you clear Corvi space," the briefing officer told him, flat and precise, the voice of someone reading a script she personally found insufficient to the moment. There is no rescue authorized. The Wayfinder will be considered a rogue vessel acting outside coalition sanction. You understand what that means? It means I'm on my own, Marsh said. It means you're on your own, she agreed. Captain, I want to be clear because Command wants it clear. You do not have to take this assignment. 3 other captains already declined. Marsh had flown with 2 of those captains before. He did not blame them. The Wayfinder carried no weapons, no shielding beyond the minimum required to survive an asteroid field, and the mission profile in front of him read less like an assignment and more like a polite way of asking a man to volunteer for his own funeral. He read it twice anyway, and both times his eyes caught on the same line in the shelter's status report: 4 hours of processed air remaining at time of departure. And he thought about how strange it was that a number that small could feel so much heavier than any casualty report he'd read in 6 years of relief work. Marsh thought about that for exactly as long as it took him to remember a winter 11 years earlier, before he'd ever worn a uniform, when a stranger with no reason at all to help him had pulled him out of a flooding transit tunnel on a rain-drowned night on Earth and never once asked his name before doing it. He had spent 11 years since then trying to find that stranger, to say thank you properly, and had never once succeeded. And somewhere along the way the not finding had turned into something else entirely. A quiet, standing debt he decided long ago he would spend the rest of his life repaying to whoever needed it next, since he could no longer repay the person who'd actually earned it. "I'll take it," he said. The Wayfinder was not built for war. She was built to carry medicine and grain and spare atmospheric processors to people who needed them. And when she dropped out of warp at the edge of Corvi space and found 3 assembly frigates already holding position over Ashmero's dying shelter, Marsh understood, with a calm that surprised him, that this was probably going to be the last flight of his career, one way or the other. "Assembly vessel, this is Captain Elias Marsh of the Independent Transport Wayfinder," he said, opening a channel with hands that were, to his own mild surprise, completely steady. "I'm here to evacuate civilian personnel from the surface shelter. I am not here to contest your ruling. I am here to save lives. Your ruling has already ended." The response took 11 long seconds. When it came, it was cold, precise, entirely without malice, in the way that made it somehow worse than anger would have been. "This is Warden Kes Ilan, Assembly Compliance Division. The Ashmero ruling is final and binding under Assembly Charter, Article 40, Section 9. Any attempt at extraction constitutes interference with a lawful compliance action. You have one warning: withdraw or be treated as a hostile vessel." Marsh looked at the shelter's life support readout on his display. 4 hours of air remaining. Not 6 days. 4 hours. The relief window the Coalition's careful, cautious authorization had banked on had been eaten alive by 3 days of committee debate, and a vote that came 7 votes too close for comfort, and now there was no time left for anything but a decision made in the space of a single breath. "Warden Ilan," Marsh said, "I want you to understand something, and I need you to hear it clearly because I only intend to say it once. I am one unarmed relief transport against 3 warships. If you want to stop me, you can. I can't fight you. I won't pretend otherwise." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped, quiet and sure, the voice of a man who had already made peace with whatever came next. "But there are 6,000 people in that shelter with 4 hours of air left, and I would rather die trying to reach them than live having turned around. So you're going to have to actually shoot me, Warden. I'm not going to make this easy by leaving on my own." 11 more seconds of silence. On Ashmero's surface, in a shelter lit by dying batteries, Sail Nithra held the hand of a child too young to understand what 4 hours meant, and listened to a transmission she was not supposed to be able to hear. An open assembly channel her people's old military-grade receivers had cracked purely out of habit, and she heard a human voice she had never met say, "I would rather die trying to reach them," and something in her chest that had gone quiet 3 days ago. When the last hope had seemed to drain out of the world along with the grid power, cracked open again, just slightly, just enough to let something like disbelief back in. "Warden," said one of the frigate officers on Ilan's own bridge, a young lieutenant who would later say this was the moment his entire understanding of the Assembly's authority began quietly to unravel. "Sir, our charter authorizes lethal force against hostile interference. That ship isn't hostile. It's unarmed. Sir, if we fire on it, we're not enforcing compliance. We're just—" He stopped, because he did not have a word for what they would be doing, and the not having, Ilan would later admit privately to exactly one person, was the thing that finally moved him. Warden Kess Ilan had enforced production rulings for 31 years. He had watched 6 species fold quietly into noncompliance shelters and never once lost sleep over it, because the arithmetic had always seemed clean to him, impersonal, the same as gravity, nobody's fault and everybody's burden equally. He had a framed commendation in his cabin for exemplary charter enforcement, and until this exact moment he had considered it the proudest achievement of his career, a testament to 3 decades of never once letting sentiment interfere with duty. He had never, in 31 years, had a single unarmed captain look down the barrel of 3 warships and refuse to turn around. He thought, in the 11 seconds before he answered, of his own daughter, 4 years old, asleep right now on a station 8 systems away, and of the promise he had made her before this deployment, that the work he did kept order in a galaxy too large and too strange for order to hold on its own. He had believed that promise when he made it. He was no longer certain, watching an unarmed cargo captain refuse to blink, that order and cruelty were as easy to tell apart as he had spent 31 years assuming. "Hold fire," he said, and the words surprised him as much as anyone on his bridge. "Let the transport pass. Log it as an unresolved compliance incident pending review." It was not mercy, exactly. Ilan would spend the rest of his career telling himself it was a technicality, a procedural gap he'd found in his own charter rather than a choice he'd made with his conscience. But 6,000 Corvi would live because of that technicality, and history, in the end, rarely bothers itself with the difference between the two. The Wayfinder's evacuation shuttles reached the surface with 41 minutes of air to spare. The shelter's remaining lights had gone the color of dying embers by the time the shuttle bay doors cracked open, and the air that rushed in from outside tasted like rust and something sourer underneath it, the toxic sublayer creeping closer with every hour that passed. Children were carried up the ramps first, wrapped in whatever blankets their parents had managed to keep, and none of them cried, which was somehow worse than if they had, because Sale understood that a child who has learned not to cry during an evacuation is a child who has already learned, far too young, exactly how frightened they are allowed to be. Sale Nithra was the last of her people to board, because she had spent every one of those 41 minutes making certain every child, every elder, every soul in that shelter was accounted for before she allowed herself to think about her own passage. And when she finally stepped through the shuttle hatch and looked back one last time at Ashmaro's poisoned sky, purple-gray and heavy with the dust that had killed her husband decades before it finally came for the rest of them, she did not cry. Because she had promised herself decades ago, she would not waste tears on things that could not be changed. She cried anyway, just once, just for a moment. Nobody who saw it thought less of her for it. Captain Elias Marsh met her at the Wayfinder's cargo bay, and he did not know the customs of her people, did not know whether to bow or clasp hands or simply stand still. So he did the only thing that felt honest, which was to kneel down to her eye level and say nothing at all until she was ready to speak first. "You did not know us," Sale said finally. "You had nothing to gain." "No," Marsh agreed, "I didn't." "Then why?" He thought about the flooded tunnel 11 years ago, the stranger whose name he never learned, The hand that pulled him out of water that would have killed him without ever once asking whether he'd earned the rescue. "Because somebody did it for me once," he said, "and I never got the chance to pay it back to the person who did it. So I figure I'll just keep paying it forward instead." Seemed like as good a reason as any to fly a very unarmed ship at 3 very armed ones. 6 months later, on a green moon in the New Providence system that the coalition had quietly signed over to Corvi administration with far less committee debate than anyone expected, Sail Nithra stood on a hillside and watched Corvi children run through grass their species had never touched before, on soil that owed them nothing and had been given to them anyway. Ambassador Ruth Osai stood beside her, having flown out personally for the settlement's naming ceremony, and for a while neither of them said anything, because some moments are better witnessed than narrated. "The assembly lodged a formal protest," Ruth said eventually, "called it an unlawful circumvention of a compliance ruling, wants sanctions." "Will there be war?" Sail asked. "Probably not. Turns out it's hard to build a war around 6,000 refugees and one very stubborn cargo captain who wouldn't turn his ship around. Makes for terrible propaganda on their end. Very good propaganda on ours, if I'm honest, which I try not to enjoy quite as much as I actually do." Ruth smiled, tired but real. "The vote to formalize your settlement passed 13-0 this time. Funny how much easier the second vote gets once people have already met the 6,000 faces the first vote was arguing about in the abstract." Sail watched a Corvi child, maybe 6 years old, chase Elias Marsh's laughing dog across the hillside grass, and she thought about 7 cold words on a cracked terminal 3 days that felt like a lifetime ago. Subsidy terminated. Compliance is not optional, and she thought about how completely, gloriously wrong that arithmetic had turned out to be, not because the equation was broken, but because somewhere out past the edge of the assembly's ledgers, an entire species had decided that worth was not something you calculated at all. "What will you name it?" Ruth asked, nodding at the settlement spreading across the valley below them, prefab shelters already giving way to real foundations, real gardens, real lives being built stone by people who had been told, only 6 months ago, that they were not worth the cost of their own air. Sail Nithra looked out over the green hills of a world that was not hers by blood or history, only by the stubborn, unglamorous kindness of strangers who had asked for nothing in return, and she smiled for the first time since she'd read those 7 words on that dying terminal. "Second Ashmoro," she said, "because a home is not the ground you're born on. It is only ever the people who decide you're worth keeping." Ruth was quiet for a moment, watching the sun drop lower over the valley, painting the new foundations gold. "You know," she said, "Voss abstained on the final vote. Didn't support it, didn't block it either. Told me afterward he couldn't stop thinking about that recording you sent. Said it was the first time in 30 years of politics he'd ever heard someone ask for help without a single word of leverage attached. Said it unsettled him more than any threat ever had." "Strange thing to be unsettled by," Sail said. "Someone simply telling the truth." "Not so strange, where I come from," Ruth said. "We're not always very good at hearing it plainly. Takes some of us longer than others to remember that a person asking for nothing but mercy is usually the one telling you exactly what kind of species you want to be." Below them, on the hillside, Elias Marsh had finally caught up to his own dog, and the sound of Corvi children laughing at the sight of him sprawled flat in the grass carried all the way up to where the 2 women stood, and Sail found, to her own quiet surprise, that the sound did not ache the way she expected it to. It simply felt, after 140 years of arithmetic, like the first honest thing anyone had offered her people in longer than she could remember. Below them, the children kept running, and the grass kept bending under their feet, and for the first time in 140 years, nobody was counting the cost of a single breath they took.